Hi, I'm Elaine Englehardt from Utah Valley University, and welcome to our discussions on democracy, sponsored by the Center for the Study of Ethics, as well as Utah Valley University as part of Utah's Democracy Project. As part of this Utah Democracy Project, we'll be presenting to you about 40 different televised programs in a variety of democratic settings. One of these settings is on human rights, and today our discussion will involve three other guests. With us we have Rocky Anderson, Professor Michael Minch, and also David Keller. And as our special guest today, Rocky, would you mind telling us about yourself as former mayor of Salt Lake, as an attorney, and then how you started this outstanding foundation?
Well, thanks, Elaine. It's a pleasure to be here, by the way, and I think this is a fantastic project. We, I think, have lost sight in very large part of the importance of democracy and what we can accomplish with our democratic tools. And it's because of that, in large part, that I decided to go to law school initially. I felt like it was a way that we could really change things for the better, people who have been disenfranchised, and practiced law for 21 years. I did a lot of civil rights work, represent a lot of plaintiffs who had been defrauded, securities fraud. I did some plaintiffs' antitrust work. And after 21 years of my law practice, I decided it was time. Well, I'd been doing a lot of work in the community with nonprofit organizations. It was time to get in the inside and try to make a difference directly impacting public policy, rather than always pushing, as it were, from the outside. So first I ran for Congress in 1996. I was Democratic nominee for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District, and then ran for mayor and served two 4-year terms as mayor in Salt Lake City. And then decided not to run for re-election a third time, and started a nonprofit organization called High Road for Human Rights, which is all about empowering people so that we exercise our democracy and push for better federal policy that will impact in a positive way the human rights of people all around the world.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you've got three big fans here from Utah Valley University. We're all interested in political philosophy and in democracy. And why don't we have Michael Minch tell you a little bit about himself and how he got involved in being an advocate in human rights projects as well as political philosophy, other than that big dissertation word and book.
Well, I'm a democratic theorist and work in democratic theory and human rights and justice issues and peace-building issues. And before I was in academia, I also directed nonprofits, namely Habitat for Humanity affiliates, and worked in public life in other ways, similarly, pushing for change from the outside. And, you need it from the outside and you need it on the inside, and you've had the privilege of being both places. So there's a lot of work to do. I always say that democracy in the United States is on life support. And although globally there's a robust resurgence of democracy going on right now, especially in Latin America, but we still have a lot to learn about it here.
Yes, sure, and I think we'll have a great conversation here. And David Keller started our Utah Democracy Project. Do you want to tell us a little bit about why you started the project and also your scholarly efforts, David?
I'm director of the Center for the Study of Ethics and professor of philosophy, and I applied for a federal grant from the Department of Education to initiate a series of discussions and educational opportunities about democracy. It seems to me that democracy does not just occur, that it has to be actively fostered, and that unless all of us are actively engaged in the promotion of democracy and running the government, that democracy cannot hope to flourish. And so I agree that with Michael that democracy in the United States is, we have a robust and proud tradition, but we need to be actively engaged and concerned with keeping democracy healthy so it doesn't languish and falter. And I think that there are some problems, especially with human rights, that need our attention.
I think democracy should usually be uncomfortable because in a democracy we're given so many privileges, and oftentimes we don't want to look at human rights suffering in other areas. Why is democracy something that we should that should always remind us that we need to be uncomfortable, that we need to be thinking of others who are being disavowed of their human rights here and in other countries?
Well, I think one of the sources of the discomfort ought to be an acknowledgement by all of us of the tremendous responsibility we have, as well as the opportunities. But along with the opportunities come those responsibilities to exercise our democracy, use the democratic tools that we have to make a difference, because there are a lot of vulnerable people, a lot of people who are suffering a great deal, and we owe it to them. We have, I think, a fundamental moral obligation, since we do have the opportunities, since we have been favored with so many privileges in our democracy, and since we have the tools. And people who can't exercise their democracy, if they live in a democracy, or those who simply are without power, who are suffering, whether it's genocides, whether it's human trafficking, including sexual slavery, these kinds of horrific abuses, political prisoners, torture. Imagine being in those circumstances and realizing these folks in the United States, if they would just exercise their democratic rights and opportunities, they could make a difference in their nation's policies and practices, which would make a huge difference in alleviating the misery that we're suffering. And so that's one source of the discomfort we all ought to feel, but it's a wonderful thing to be a moral actor, to realize that's part of our humanness, is to exercise the power that we have to help make a difference for other people. And unfortunately, even in our democracy, our nation has betrayed that promise of never again after the Holocaust, time after time after time. We have stood by and watched as millions of people during the last century have been killed, have been subjected to horrible torture, to women in rape camps in Bosnia. We knew that was going on, and as a nation, we didn't lift a finger. And as individuals, most of us didn't push in our democracy for a difference to be made. So a democracy is a wonderful thing, but only if you use it. And we can certainly utilize our democracy to make a huge difference for those who are in need, who are most vulnerable.
The idea of fundamental human rights seems to me based on an idea that each one of us, each person, each human individual has some kind of intrinsic value that ought not to be violated or transgressed. It seems as though there might be many separate ways of envisioning what gives us this inner humanity that gives us fundamental human rights. It might be that theologically that we're each children of God, and that God has given us that intrinsic value, or that we're each biological individuals that can be harmed or helped. How do you, philosophically speaking, envision the foundation of human rights? What is it that gives us human rights?
And while you answer that brilliant question, tell us a little bit about your organization and how your organization works through these kinds of questions.
You know, all of our fundamental humanitarian and religious traditions converge at one point, and that is, if there are people who are suffering and we have the capacity to relieve that suffering, we have an obligation to do that. And they don't have to be right in front of us. And I think that's a big mistake that a lot of us make, as we look away if people are halfway around the world. But we need to recognize the suffering is the same. They're still our brothers and sisters, whether they're our next door neighbor or they're in another nation, we've never met them before. And so there have developed under international law, and this all comes from a basic position of morality, universal morality. There have developed these standards of human rights, the right to life, the right to shelter, the right to basic medical treatment, the right to the sustainability of one's culture, not have their culture wiped out, not to be run off from their homes. And these are ideas that have gained consensus, but all pinned on fundamental philosophical agreement. The question is, I think, what is it that we do to back up those human rights that are guaranteed both under international law and that we assume given our humanitarian and religious traditions? And unfortunately in this country there is a huge disconnect between the rights that we recognize, whether from a moral point of view or from an international legal point of view, and what it is that our nation and what it is that we as individuals have done to protect those human rights. And I say there's a great disconnect because, as I mentioned earlier, we keep breaching that promise of never again after the Holocaust. We swore, people in the international community were in agreement. Never again will we stand by and allow men, women, and children to suffer such atrocities anywhere in the world. And yet, you look at the 2 million people who died under the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. We in the United States and as an international community did nothing to stop that. Same thing in Bosnia for a good 3.5, 4 years. Torture camps, rape camps, the murder of people wholesale to get people to accomplish the ethnic cleansing, to make certain people would never return to their homeland, displacement of hundreds of thousands of people. We saw it in Rwanda. 800,000 people butchered in 100 days as not only the Clinton administration, but Congress and the American people sat on their hands and allowed it to happen with almost not even a whimper of opposition. In fact, we helped accommodate it because the Clinton administration, through the United Nations, made sure that many of our UN troops that were on the ground were pulled out, rather than adding the 5,500 troops that Romeo Dallaire, the UN commander on the ground at the time, said it would have taken. That's all it would have taken, he said, to have stopped that genocide. So we turn a blind eye to that, and then President Bush reads a memorandum about Rwanda, writes in the margin, not on my watch, and now we're in the 6th year of a genocide in Sudan. Horrendous. The hundreds of thousands of people killed in the Darfur region of Sudan, over 1 million people displaced, run off from their homes. What a horrible tragedy. As we sit here today, and once in a while we'll read a little blurb, usually on the inside of the newspaper. I don't think it's made the headlines, the front page, for many, many years. And every once in a while we'll see a demonstration. But Congress never acts. Our president, whether Republican or Democrat, never acts. That has been the history unless they're pushed to act. And that's, when we're talking about democracy, that is crucial to seeing a change here, because if we don't exercise our democracy, each one of us, and push for change, the elected officials aren't going to do anything about it. That has been, by and large, the history in terms of these kinds of atrocities. And again, the same thing with regard to human trafficking, torture, imprisonment of political prisoners, and the human rights implications of climate change, which are going to be, if climate change, if we don't reverse the trend toward catastrophic, irreversible climate change, we will see the greatest violations of human rights ever in human history.
You might mention, because Elaine asked, how High Road for Human Rights is a response to everything you just said, because I happen to know that that you founded High Road just exactly to address these issues in a particular way, and I'm sure our audience would be interested in knowing how High Road does that.
It's because of my conclusion after reading a great deal about the history of these human rights atrocities and the failure of U.S. policy and the failure of international policy, but that's often driven by what the United States does. The failure to respond over and over again has been tied to the failure of the American people to push our leaders. Anthony Lake, President Clinton's national security advisor, said 2 weeks into the Rwandan genocide, if you, the international human rights community, want to see us push for intervention and put an end to this genocide, you're going to have to, in his words, make more noise. You've got to change public opinion. And the Clinton administration, their political calculation was there wasn't any call by the American people to do anything, so they sat it out. And in fact, there wasn't more noise made. There wasn't an organized effort among the American people to push for change. So we all sat by while 800,000 people perished. And these kinds of accounts you find over and over again in the literature. So what we're doing at High Road for Human Rights, and it's absolutely unique in the human rights community. There are great human rights organizations that do their field work and reporting and provide great intelligence and do high-level one-on-one lobbying, and a lot on the internet now, getting people to send letters in and that sort of thing. But our effort is strictly focused on getting people in local communities all over the country organized, all on the same page as to the same issues, the same concrete solutions, and we're all pushing in the same direction. And as we do that, our congresspeople, our senators are never going to be able to go back to Washington and say, my constituents don't care. Frank McCloskey was a member of Congress during the Bosnian genocide, and he was absolutely committed. He was one of the rare ones who took it upon himself. He went over a dozen times to see what was happening. He was appalled. He saw the responsibility we had and the power we had to make a real difference. And he was met consistently by his congressional colleagues as he was trying to do something to put an end to the genocide happening in Bosnia. Met over and over again by his congressional colleagues who said, why do you care about Bosnia? We never hear from our constituents. Our constituents don't care. What does this have to do with Decatur, Illinois? Those were the responses. And imagine if these people, every time they came home, there was an organized effort. Every time they came out in public, held a town meeting, there were people who were on the same page as others throughout the country pushing on that issue. They would have gone back and said, we better do something because the people back home expect that of us. That has been the failure. And so what we're doing with High Road for Human Rights is providing that organizing mechanism, allowing people the means to become empowered as they join with others with a strategy, a grassroots activism strategy, where we ask people, will you write letters to the editor? Will you meet with local editorial boards? Will you attend town meetings? When your congressman or senator, congresswoman comes home, they've got to hear from you. Will you be part of a phone tree? Look at Gail Ruzicka. She controls the Utah legislature in many instances because she has a powerful phone tree.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine if there was that sort of thing going on during the Rwandan genocide and Congress and the president were being pushed? I think President Clinton would be grateful if he had been pushed to do something about Rwanda. He said it's his greatest regret from his presidency that he didn't do anything to stop that genocide. But it was up to us. We can't sit back. And I think there's a real danger now with President Obama, President-elect Obama, coming into office. Everybody's sitting back and saying, oh, now everything's going to be great. We're going to see him take care of everything. It will not happen. It's never happened in this country unless we continue to push.
You know, I've been to your website several times as well as numerous presentations, and in there you try to make it very accessible for people to be activists in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so often when you hear the word activist, then people start saying, oh, well, this must be part of one political party or another political party, or I just don't want to get involved. But I think that you really help us understand the deprivation of liberty for so many people and the gifts that people here have. So how do people find out more about becoming part of High Road? Is it all on your website? And maybe you can tell us the website.
We've got a lot on the website. It's at www.highroadforhumanrights.org. We have a letter there right now that people can sign on to, and we're going to get back that letter. We have over 5,000 signatures now. We're shooting for 10,000 or more that we will send to every member of Congress, that will make sure gets to President-elect Obama's attention, calling for an absolute end to torture, and not just for the period of the Obama administration, but that we put in legal protections to make absolutely certain this never happens again, and to restore the rule of law. To stop the practice of signing statements, for instance, where under President Bush, he'd sign legislation and then issue a signing statement saying that as head of the, what he calls the unitary executive branch, he'll decide whether the legislation applies to the administrative branch, and if so, to what extent, or he'll define what the words mean of the legislation. That is a complete violation of our system of checks and balances. So we have that on our website. We have a means for people to contribute financially, and it takes that. If we don't get the financial support, we won't be able to continue on. That's just and in these economic times, it's really important for everybody to step forward as they can, because nobody's picking up the full load anymore.
It's worth saying too, so the audience knows, that we're now forming a High Road for Human Rights chapter in Utah County and at Utah Valley University. So people who have a connection with this school should know that's another place to concretely get involved.
Thanks for mentioning that.
Yeah, go ahead,
And if
Rocky.
people sign up on our website, say you get on under Take Action, there's a list of things. Would you be interested in doing any of these kinds of things, like attending town meetings of members of Congress? Or would you be willing to go talk to somebody on an editorial board, or go talk to a class, or a faith organization or civic organization? And we have the materials. We'll provide those materials so people can go out in their community. In fact, one of the members of the Utah Valley University chapter came up to me today and said, I want your DVD. I'm going to go talk to a class. That's exactly how this works and how it ends up snowballing into a mass movement. And you know, the word activism, you're right. People say, oh, does that mean it's too political, that it's one party or another? No, it's just that's how we exercise our democracy. Rather than being a passive observer, and I always make the case, as has been made by many over the years, if you sit back passively, you're supporting the status quo. Ethically, you don't get to sit it out. As a human being, you either stand up against wrongdoing or you're complicit in the wrongdoing. And those who say, well, I don't know about it, I didn't know this was going on, you also have a duty to find out what's going on. If your brothers and sisters anywhere are suffering and you can do something about it, you've got an obligation to find out about it and then take the next step, and that is to do something about it. So we're all about raising consciousness in local communities about these issues, and then getting people, once they understand what's happening, then to move in to taking action and doing it very simply. And we help coordinate it, and we make sure that this is happening all over the country. And that's how we will see changes in U.S. policies and practices impacting human rights.
Our entire conversation so far has made an implicit point that I would just like to briefly make explicit. We've all been using the word democracy as though it is a moral term. And I think most people watching the program will probably think that's odd, because they think of it as a political term. They think of it as a form of government or something like that, holding free and fair elections and so on. But the word means power of the people. It means power for people, and you've made this point. But of course, that's a moral conception that all human beings, because of their dignity, because of our intrinsic value, as David said moments ago, deserve to have the capacity to exercise power in their own lives in various ways. And so it's important to, I think, make this clear that the very meaning of democracy is at its root, from beginning to end, it has a moral meaning, as you've been saying over and again. But I think it might strike the listener a little bit odd at first blush, because they think it means that you get to vote for who holds office, and that's the end of it.
People view politics in such a partisan way too, and yet the word politics, the definition that I like when we talk about politics is that it's one's approach to public policy. And again, we can't check out of that. If you say, I don't really care about those things, I don't feel like I can do anything about it, then you are on the side of the wrongdoing. If it's going on, there are so many things any one person can do. And when we're told that you can't, really the forces behind the status quo have won. And unfortunately, with the money in politics now, I have a question as to whether we really have a political democracy in this country, because where does the power come from? How are people getting elected?
Well, technically we live in a plutocracy, right? A corporate state.
Or an oligarchy.
Yeah.
But there's so much that we can do. Only if we allow that to happen does it come down to that. Even when there is so much money in the system, if we believe strongly in doing the right thing and helping people out and bringing about a better government, then we've got to become active. Activists, if that word scares people away, just think of it in terms of being a moral actor, that you're going to do something about it.
I like that, having moral concerns. And I think that's why the three of us are such strong supporters of you, because we've had moral concerns that we've really pushed. And David, maybe you could tell us how you've become active in your community. And certainly I know how Michael has become active in peace and justice studies.
I'm probably not an exemplar of activism, because most of what I do is from campus. But I believe that that if I have a calling in the world, it's to be in the classroom and to get students to think about these things. And the point that Michael just brought up, the two different meanings of the word democracy, the moral meaning and the political meaning. I like to bring attention to Utah Valley University students that those two meanings converge at the individual level, and they converge in terms of personal individual responsibility and moral duty, and that living in a democracy is an onerous responsibility. It's not an easy form of government to be in, because, as you pointed out, if you're passive and you do nothing, you're taking a political position by supporting the status quo. But I think that that it's absolutely essential that we all come together, and each individual, independently of our vocation, whether it's managing a tire store, being a philosophy professor or a politician, or the head of an NGO, is to become educated on the issues. So what I try to do in my life is to just have public discussions on campus and in the classroom, and try to convey, and this is what Michael does so well too, and you as well, that independently of your religion or your vocational interests, all of us have the responsibility to be concerned what's happening to our fellow human beings on the other side of the world, and that if we're not concerned, we are not living up to our obligations as citizens in a democracy, not just a national democracy, but a global democracy.
I would imagine that you sponsor at least 120 programs a year where you open a lot of different topics to people and raise consciousness. And I think what Rocky's been saying is so much of this is just raising consciousness, that it's not that people are opposed to this, it's just finding out about it. And the issues that you bring before the students have been every year are very important, and that's what your peace and justice studies do too. Almost like that people wouldn't talk about peace before you said, "Hey, this is really a good word."
Well, we are building a peace and justice studies program here at the university, and its purpose is not only to make people aware of the problems that exist in the world, but to empower them, enable them, equip them, inform them, and train them to be agents of change, to be peace builders, to be justice builders. And as you said, Rocky, we're not locked into the bad news of our existence. We're not locked into continuous, endless genocides and the effects of global warming and sex trafficking and so on. All of those things can change. We know empirically from history, from the change that has happened all around us historically and is happening even now all around the world, that things can change. People simply need to be educated into the details of how the change is made. And that's what we're doing in the Peace and Justice Studies program here. We're giving students the kind of training they need to go into the world and change it for the better.
The education and then the action.
Yeah.
And there's so much talked about in terms of consciousness raising and education, but then if we don't take it to the next step, action, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference. I was at the premiere of an amazing documentary film called The Day My God Died about sex slavery in India. It's up in Park City, 750 people showed up, great turnout. They all stuck around for panel discussion afterwards. And then you could feel this universal sense in the auditorium of frustration. Now they were upset. Most of them had just learned that this was going on through this film. They were impassioned about it. They were motivated to do something about it. And then the question was asked, so now that we're all upset about it, what can we do? What can we do to stop this? And there was no action suggested to them. And that was a huge moment for me in deciding to move forward with this organization, because if you could tap that passion that people have, the caring, and we know that there are tools that can be put to use to change public policy in this country that can really impact these problems. I mean, for instance, if there were economic sanctions, if there were incentives for these governments to make sure their police weren't going around to the brothels collecting their weekly pay, their bribes. If we could help clean these things up, we could make a real difference. And again, it's not just a matter of being the world's policeman. It's a matter of working with the international community to help our brothers and sisters anywhere around the world. And political boundaries don't matter. That's the one thing people need to understand. Political boundaries, when it comes to our moral obligations to our brothers and sisters, have nothing to do with those obligations.
In your presentations, that you really do tell people there's something they can do. One thing I remember you saying in regard to the child sex trafficking was anyone who is not opposed to prostitution is in some way complicit with this. You have to be opposed to prostitution, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more how it all starts with legitimizing prostitution and why it's not a victimless crime.
The United Nations peacekeepers in different parts of the world are part of the greatest portion of the market for the sex trade. Our own service people. We don't have a no-tolerance policy in our military for our service people who frequent prostitutes. Isn't that shocking?
It is.
And if they are having sex with somebody who is there, either underage or somebody who's of the age of majority but who's been forced into the sex trade, that is rape.
And how would they know? Are they going to ask those questions when they're there?
I don't think that's what they're interested in.
No.
But that's why policy is so important. There should be automatic dishonorable discharge and prosecution for any of our service people who are engaged in that kind of conduct.
This is one of the primary reasons why U.S. military personnel are unwelcome and not appreciated in our many installations around the world.
Absolutely right.
Yeah.
It happened in Cambodia. The United Nations, the head of the United Nations peacekeeping force there was, when these complaints were made about so much HIV and AIDS being spread by U.S. or by United Nations peacekeepers, he just brushed it off and said, well, what are you going to do with these hot-blooded 18-year-old men? They go out and work all day, and there's no way to stop it. And of course, there was huge backlash among the Cambodian people. They were blaming these peacekeepers for the spread of HIV/AIDS in their nation. There are so many concrete things that can be done. We have federal legislation right now having to do with protection of women who are caught up in the sex trade. And the President Bush, has said all the right things about it. And there's financial disincentives that are available under this legislation, sanctions that can be imposed on what they call the Tier 3 countries, those who have been ranked the worst by the State Department, where the sex trade, sex slavery is a huge problem and the nations aren't doing anything to stop it. But President Bush has granted waivers to countries like Saudi Arabia and Kuwait because all other interests seem to trump the interests against the sex trade, sex slavery. And we've just got to get to the point in this country where we say, you don't let other interests trump that. If this is being allowed, we care enough about these young girls and women that we have to, as a nation, be a leader among the international community. And we can do that. It can be stopped. But we're only going to see those changes if we all push for it.
Rocky at Bear is saying that there are 300,000 sex slaves in the United States, girls and women traded into, who have been trafficked here and are being used that way.
Right.
So it's not, so, you know, again, our listeners shouldn't simply be thinking of Thailand and Cambodia and Philippines and other places. I have a friend who's a director of a rescue mission. There are 140 rescue missions in the United States. And he told me, they're rescue missions after all. One of the things we need to do is rescue these girls, rescue these women. So he's now engaged in a national program to use these institutions for that very purpose. Yeah. So it's a problem that needs to be attacked, and can be attacked on many different levels.
Another part that I noticed, which is one of these downstream effects, when I was in Cambodia about a year ago doing some humanitarian work, I started at some orphanages. And the reason why there are those orphanages is the sex trade. It's these women who are sold into the sex trade, they have babies, they die of AIDS, they die of some horrible STD that isn't controlled, and then there's a proliferation of orphanages and not enough funds to support them. So just being there with the orphanages, also seeing that there are clinics there that can't help out all of those who are in need of this kind of help. And
again, recognizing that we can make the difference. This isn't, you know, Samantha Power wrote a book about genocide and the American non-response to genocide. It's called A Problem from Hell, and the title is in quotation marks because that is the excuse we keep giving for these problems, as if it's inevitable, as if, oh, this is just a problem from hell, what are you going to do about it? It's been going on for generations. It simply isn't true. It's happening in our time, and genocides especially are usually not a necessary result of these age-old conflicts. People engage in them because of political advantage. Right. That certainly happened in Bosnia. It happened in Rwanda. Hutus and Tutsis were living next door to each other in peace before all this happened. But then you get people manipulating them, making the Hutus for the Tutsis, and dehumanizing them, all that it takes to turn ordinary people into people who have the capacity to engage in these kinds of atrocities. But we could make such a huge difference. And again, not just us taking unilateral action, but working with the international community to make a difference. And we owe it to the people, both who are going through this now and those in the future who will. And I can't imagine anything more tragic than a young girl. That's how the title of this documentary came about. The girl said, "The day I was kidnapped and forced into the sex trade was the day my God died." Oh. It's so sad when you think of the individual lives, this happening, and in that culture where they can't let their families know what happened to them. I've interviewed women in the sex trade in New Delhi who were forced into the sex trade. Now they're getting older, they're less desirable to the customers. Some of them get STDs. They have no training. They can't go back to their families because they'll bring dishonor upon them in that culture. Think of the sense of hopelessness that these women have. And it goes on everywhere, including a big problem in the United States. But Eastern Europe, since the dissolution of the USSR, huge numbers of women who are being lied to, told that there are these other employment opportunities. These folks get a hold of them. The Russian mafia, very powerful. They have their breaking camps in Bosnia. They take their they have no way out. They become completely disappeared, held in what are essentially prisons, and forced into the sex trade until they're of no longer use to those who are exploiting them.
What if there is a shoe or a clothing factory in some foreign country, Indonesia or China or somewhere else, that is making duds for you and I? And the working conditions in this factory are in violation of at least U.S. and or international law. You know, the people that work there maybe work 16 hours a day under horrific conditions, sweltering heat, not enough ventilation, dangerous machinery that could result in injury and death, so on and so forth. But the people that live in that area have no other employment opportunities. So hypothetically, they're better off working in this factory under almost intolerable conditions to make a bit of money rather than living in complete poverty. The reason this has created a lot of interesting discussion in my ethics and values classes is that some students will say working in those conditions is an absolute violation of human rights, that no one anywhere should be subjected to those kind of conditions. Other students will say, well, but they're still better off, so it should be tolerated.
It shouldn't be one or the other, complete unemployment and starvation and all the rest and poverty versus working in these kinds of conditions. But we, under our trade agreements, by not putting in minimal labor protections, by not putting in minimal environmental protections, have helped create that situation. There need to be in any trade agreements, NAFTA, CAFTA, all the rest, minimal protections for those engaged in labor. If American corporations are outsourcing, then they need to observe those standards. Right. And the fact that we don't have them in place, I just say shame on us for putting anybody in the position of having to accept those conditions or accept utter poverty and perhaps starvation and all the rest.
I've heard claims that just across the U.S. border in Mexico are those kind of conditions, and yet we're trading freely with Mexico.
It can be attacked not only by public policy and law, but it can be attacked by the consumers themselves. You know, when we go to a grocery store and we buy produce or meat, we buy it with a great deal of confidence that it will be safe. It's safe because there are federal meat inspectors and food inspectors around the country making sure our food is safe. There are all kinds of regimes of inspection that can be implemented, that can be invented and can be applied. There could be a global inspection regime that goes into factories everywhere and make sure that apparel is not being created in that way. And if it were all the apparel we buy could have a tag on it that guarantees, just like our food does, that it's apparel made without this kind of labor attached to it, and all other apparel would be boycotted. And that would transform in this case, the apparel industry quickly.
Yeah, well, there have been those impacts with some American companies that we know about.
Sure.
Where basically horrific conditions, especially for young people working in these factories, and they've been exposed. But then is the choice that they don't bring in any income and their families are destitute. So I think you're absolutely right that we have those standards in place, either by law under trade agreements, that absolutely should be done, or we have a set of standards and people go around and we know whether these products have the stamp of approval, as it were, that these people are not working under those conditions. I talked to some folks in Salt Lake City who have their products manufactured in China. Well, they went over to the warehouse and they found out these Chinese workers were sleeping on cots in the warehouse. They were there basically 24 hours a day, no ventilation with toxic fumes.
Right.
And at least they had the moral sense of saying no more of this. We're not going to buy products that are made under these conditions, even if it ends up costing us more.
And there's still this question, of course, in principle, but what if they're better off under these horrible conditions than they would be otherwise? But you're right. The answer is that's an unacceptable either or.
Yeah.
You know, have a global minimum wage, have a regimes inspection system, have international trade agreements that are robust enough to allow all kinds of improvements in global labor everywhere and create the market demand such that those minimal labor standards have to be met.
And it's not only good for the workers in those countries, it's good for our own workers, because we cannot be competitive
Right.
in this country if American corporations are outsourcing and it's basically slave labor producing their goods.
That's a really interesting point, because one reason why foreign corporations are able to undercut American companies and American laborers might be on account of human rights violations. But if those were mitigated, then it would level
Sure.
the labor playing field, as it were, and make
Somewhat.
America corporations more
The only thing
competitive.
cheaper than cheap labor is free labor.
Yeah.
There are 27 million slaves in the world.
More,
Right now.
More slaves on the planet today than ever in the history.
In our culture, we are habituated to have this idea that the human condition is gradually getting better all the time. Progress and technology, and as time marches on, things are getting better. But then I hear a statistic like that, and it gives me pause, and I think, is the human condition really progressing to a better state all the time? Are we really better off at the beginning of the 21st century than we were in the 19th century?
Does it all come down to power and who's powerful and who's powerless? Does it come down to greed, and does it come down to negligence and this plutocracy that Michael was talking about? Is it a world of business, and whoever's making the most money and has the most toys, they win, and the rest of it doesn't really matter? Have we changed our values for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness just to life, liberty, and the pursuit of money?
I don't think human nature or our character has changed, but our tools have, our information have, our awareness of what happens in the world and what can be done about it. These are new facts about contemporary life. And so those facts about contemporary life shouldn't give us despair. Those facts about contemporary life should give us hope. It's not that we're any worse or any better, I don't think, than our forebears. It's just that circumstances have changed of various kinds. But I think part of what's changed is that we know that we can make changes now and solve our problems in ways that previous generations couldn't have known. And in fact, they couldn't have solved their problems. We live, for example, in the first generation in human history that can actually end starvation if we wanted to. But that couldn't have been done before until now. So I think there's more hope in here than despair,
I
actually.
think so, and to see an organization such as High Road for Human Rights start, flourish, have an incredible board of directors who really want to see it thrive and move forward, and see the eradication of some of these desperate human practices, inhumane practices.
It's all driven by hope and an optimism that by us all pushing together, organizing together, that we can make a real difference. Otherwise, I would have gone and done something else. I'm hugely optimistic, but that doesn't mean that I'm not also very concerned about how things are going in this world and how they've been going in this nation for the past several years. Because not since Jimmy Carter was president have we heard anybody say that human rights is going to be a significant driver in our foreign relations. That struck me back then. It's like, well, of course, hasn't it always, shouldn't it always be? It seems like that's so fundamental, and it turns out that was such an aberration for a president to say that human rights is going to play a significant role in us determining how we're going to conduct ourselves. But to show how bad it's been during the first Bush administration, the father Bush, his Secretary of State said about Saddam Hussein, it was right after Saddam Hussein actually possessed and used chemical weapons of mass destruction against the Kurds, and before that against the Iranians, and was engaged unquestionably in a genocide against the Kurdish people. Our Secretary of State, James Baker, who ironically was one of the co-chairs of the Iraq report study group, he said, for us to marginalize Saddam Hussein would mean the marginalization of U.S. business, particularly agricultural interests. And after Hussein engaged in that genocide, killing tens of thousands of Kurdish people with chemical weapons, the United States doubled his agricultural credits. That shows how little fundamental human rights has played into American foreign policy since Jimmy Carter.
Sadly, we're running out of time, but that point brings us back full circle to a point that you began with, and that is U.S. inaction is often explainable in terms of complacency on our parts. The people that are their human rights are being violated just are not in front of us. They're not part of our community. But I wonder to what degree is it explainable in terms of expediency? Sometimes it's not to the interest of the U.S. economically to intervene in some of these problems.
Well, it still comes down to values. And are our leaders going to buck the American people if the American people were organized and pushing for human rights to be respected? They're going to do whatever their short-term political interests tell them they need to do. It's always been the case. And it's our fault if we're not communicating to them what it is not only that we want them to do, but what we insist that they do, and getting across that if they don't do it, we're going to be voting somebody else into office. There are going to be those political prices for them. Now, there are exceptions, like the Frank McCloskeys, who do what they're doing for the right reasons, but they're never going to be able to get to where they want to go, as in Frank McCloskeys' case, unless others feel that their constituents want them to get on board. And that's the importance of all of us becoming activists and doing it from that sort of moral grounding, consistent with our long-term, either religious or humanitarian or both traditions.
That's a perfect way to wrap up this discussion that we've had today. Thank you so much, Rocky, for joining us at Utah Valley University.
Real pleasure.
As part of this Utah Democracy Project. Thank you, Michael Minch.
You bet.
Keep up all the good work. And thanks to David Keller. Glad that you started this programming and that we can focus more on democracy and human rights. Thank you.